Shabbat Shalom. And Mazel Tov to our Bat Mitzvah family. As I have mentioned from this bima, and as I am sure I will mention repeatedly, my grandfather, of blessed memory, was the wisest person I know. A person who loved to share his wisdom. I have strong memories of being in my grandparents' home around the Shabbat table or enjoying a cup of coffee in the living room, and he would often give myself and my cousins and siblings unsolicited but nonetheless appreciated advice. One such memory, after spending time together one sunny afternoon, occurred as I was about to bid farewell. I truthfully cannot remember what we'd been talking about, but something in our conversation must have triggered him to feel the need to stop me in the hallway and to say one of his two core pieces of counsel: never make the same mistake twice. I was a teenager when he told me this, and it has stuck with me ever since. Nowhere is this perhaps clearer than in our parasha this morning, Shoftim, which outlines the idea of Shalosh Arim Tavdil, that 3 cities of refuge should be designated for a person who has accidentally committed murder. And this was the section that Pavle read so beautifully earlier. To be frank, this is a rather confronting and confusing commandment, since it might be fair to think to ourselves that murder is murder, no matter what. According to the Torah, though, apparently not, as it distinguishes in detail the extraordinarily specific circumstances under which a person is able to utilize these safe havens. Namely, the killer must have committed the crime unwittingly and not have been enemies with the slain in the past. The example highlighted in the Torah is of a man who goes out to chop wood in a grove and whose axe accidentally flies off the handle, striking the other person mistakenly, a nature image which we'll circle back to later. The other example is essentially one of self-defense, in which someone pursuing a killer in their white-hot anger may overtake the killer and strike them down. With these boundaries firmly in place, the Midrash subsequently interprets this commandment as a demonstration of God's loving kindness towards humans back from the time of the Garden of Eden. When asking the question of why the first man, Adam, was not condemned to immediate death upon eating from the tree of knowledge, we are reminded that God instead drove Adam and Eve out of the garden, where they lived for many hundreds of years, a sentence which is equated to being exiled to one of these cities of refuge. Immediately following the Midrash, Moses then poses the fair question of how the person who is fleeing will know how to find one of these cities. So we'll hold on to this question too, because we'll answer it shortly. Although we may not be thinking about quite such egregious, serious crimes in our context here today, one of the messages of these cities of refuge remains poignant: that we are inherently deeply flawed creatures who sometimes make mistakes. It is arguably ingrained in our very nature, this biological brokenness, with our Torah full of stories of imperfect beings, from Adam and Eve stealing from the tree of knowledge, to Cain killing his brother Abel, to Rebekah tricking her husband Isaac into giving the wrong son his birthright, to Moses smashing the 2 tablets as he descended Mount Sinai and saw his people dancing around a golden calf. Later in the parasha, as Rabbi Splansky just spoke about, we read the verse, Tamim tihiyeh im Adonai Elohecha. You shall be wholehearted with Adonai, your God. This may sound a little strange to our ears because elsewhere in our Torah, as Rabbi Splansky pointed out, Tamim is translated as innocent or simple or blameless or even perfect, but here in Deuteronomy, it is translated as wholehearted. Rabbi Jim Simon subsequently believes that this was what was being asked of Abraham back in Genesis: not to be perfect or to never make a mistake, but rather to be wholehearted, as the challenge of being human is so great that it is impossible to get right every time. The challenge instead is to approach God, to approach our lives with wholeheartedness and sincerity. However, there is another idea that the Midrash brings to the surface. God's response to Moses' question, which we're now answering, of how someone would find their way to one of the closest cities of refuge, are the very words of the parasha, Tahin l'cha haderech, prepare for yourself the path. According to the Midrash, tracks and signs and all manner of navigational help were permitted, conveying the notion that finding the way back should always be a possibility. Nonetheless, we might be left with the question, here in our own time and place, we don't have cities of refuge. So what is our path, our track, our sign? The answer, in Jewish terms, we might call teshuvah. That being said, teshuvah, this finding our way back, does not mean returning to the same point as before, exactly the same as we were. This is the very essence of the Maimonidean idea that teshuvah is about encountering the same scenario as beforehand and not repeating the same mistake. It is the essence of what my grandfather of blessed memory meant when he told me not to repeat the same mistake twice. Teshuvah is, to paraphrase Rabbi Allen's little book about the High Holy Days, this is real and you were totally unprepared, all of the classical definitions we are familiar with, repentance, returning, a turning, and none of those things being so much more. Rabbi Allen Lu writes that teshuvah might equally be a homecoming of sorts, and of how we Jews are obsessed with this idea. Abraham is the one who famously leaves his home, the land of his ancestors. We devote significant time and attention in our calendar to mourning and longing for a home that no longer exists on Tisha B'Av, or building a home that is not really a home on Sukkot. Indeed, the book of Deuteronomy, from which we read today, is entirely set on the edge of the land of Israel, as the people stand on the border ready to finally enter the place that they have been told is their home, the one that God has promised to themselves and their ancestors for generations. Yet the home we might leave, Rabbi Allen Lu states, is necessarily a different place than the one we eventually come back to. We can think of our own childhood homes to further use the examples from Rabbi Lu. Whether we're from Toronto or not, we might have experienced that underlying sense of dislocation when we visit our parents for the holidays and sleep in our childhood bedrooms, surrounded by all our old toys and books and clothes and so on, despite being fully grown adults. Or wandering the well-worn streets of your hometown, so familiar and yet so distant, as the shop windows change, new condos are put up, or any other number of subtle alterations take place. This need to return is a primal impulse, Lu continues, one that propels us down the river of life, in which we experience bumps and bruises along the way as we become whole people, flaws and all. With that in mind, the second crucial piece of advice that my grandfather told us was, "To thine own self be true," quoting the Shakespeare. Teshuvah, as such, is that fluid notion of returning home, of finding our way back to our true selves, that is really a return to ourselves along the fluid course of life's journey. Despite the disorientation, perhaps we can determine that our tradition welcomes this phenomenon, because that teshuvah, that homecoming, becomes the place that signals the start of real growth. As Rabbi Matthew Sofer reminds us, in this month of Elul, we are encouraged to make teshuvah, to find our way back home, by practicing behaviors that return us to the best and holiest versions of ourselves. In short, behaviors that encourage us to grow. Back to our nature metaphor, nature imagery, Sofer frames this through the commandment found a little later in our parasha, in chapter 20, to not cut down any fruit-bearing trees, also known as bal tashchit, not to destroy. The text itself reads, "When in war against a city you have to besiege, you must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh lavo mipanecha? Is the tree of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? If read as a question, it sounds a little bit rhetorical, sparking the imaginations of the generations of commentators who then explore it. One such commentator is the 13th century grammarian Abraham ibn Ezra, who paints upon the canvas of this verse a highly distinctive interpretation. He claims that it is not a question at all, but rather a statement. Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh. The human being is a tree of the field. How radically does it change a seemingly simple sentence when read in a different intonation? Another 13th century product, this time in the form of a commentary, the Sefer HaChinuch, also elaborates on this verse and reads, "The purpose of this commandment, Bal Tashchit, is to teach us to love that which is good and worthwhile and to cling to it, so that good becomes a part of us and we will avoid all that is evil and destructive, that nothing, not even a grain of mustard, should be lost to the world." Through the lens of Ibn Ezra and the Sefer HaChinuch, we are bidden to ask the important questions. Are we helping ourselves to grow, blossoming into new life and possibilities in the season of Elul, a time of renewal and return, or cutting ourselves down, leaving destruction in our wake? Finally, the Midrash Rabbah teaches us that to each blade of grass belongs an angel who nudges it from heaven and whispers to it, "Grow, grow." Therefore, during the season of Elul, a season in we, like the blades of grass, are urged to grow towards creation, towards goodness, towards wholeness, towards ourselves, and towards God, may we find our way home once again, perfectly imperfect. Shabbat Shalom.